Welcome to the Nick Blevins Family Ministry Podcast. Our goal is to help you maximize your church's potential. You'll hear from top leaders in children's, student, and family ministry about the principles and practices they use. Now here's your host, Nick Blevins.
Hey everybody, welcome to the podcast. I'm Nick, I'm your host, and in today's episode I talk with Brad Griffin, the Associate Director at the Fuller Youth Institute. You may be familiar with the book Growing Young that they just released in the last year or so, and it's a great book that is really the culmination of a bunch of research to figure out how do churches that reach young people, how do they do that? How do they do it well? And you'd be surprised if you haven't read the book or seen any of the information about that. It might surprise you what matters and what doesn't. So Brad and I talk about that. We talk about some of the findings that are in the book, but we also talk about some other things related to reaching young people and some other studies and things like that. So it's a great conversation. I love the work they do there. So I hope you're going to get a lot out of this episode, because I sure did, and I'm loving the book, and I know there's going to be more that I'm going to get out of it in the future. Before we jump into that interview, though, just want to remind you that we're coming up on 1 year of the podcast, which is crazy. It's gone by really fast. It's been a lot of fun. And all the thanks goes to you for listening and sharing it and leaving ratings on iTunes and things like that, and sending in, suggestions and questions and people you want to hear from and all that. Can't believe it's been 1 year. It's been a lot of fun. And we're going to celebrate that by giving a bunch of stuff away. So just be on the lookout for that. And also, we're going to do a special Q&A episode to hit some questions that you all have sent in over the last year, but we haven't been able to get to yet. And if you have any more questions, go ahead and send those in as well. You can email me at nick@nickblevins.com, or send it on Twitter. You can go on nickblevins.com and use the little leave a message, a voice message link on the right there, and you can kind of leave a voicemail. Just make sure you say who you are and what your question is, and we might put that on the episode as well. So be sure to do that. Another thing, if you're listening to this when it comes out, it's Orange Conference Week, and I'm at the Orange Conference. I love going to the Orange Conference every year. If you're there, if you're going to be there, go ahead and hit me up on Twitter and let me know. I'd love to connect with you and meet you. And I have the honor of leading a breakout with Jim Weidman. That's sure going to be a lot of fun. If by chance you're going to be in that breakout, give me a heads up for sure. But I love the Orange Conference. I love connecting with other leaders and learning from them and seeing all the new stuff that Orange has each year. So be sure to let me know if you're there, and I'd love to connect. Our guest today, Brad Griffin, will also be at the Orange Conference. He's going to be leading a breakout about the Growing Young study, which I'm sure a lot of people are going to attend because it's just great stuff. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and jump into my conversation with Brad. Today, I'm joined by Brad Griffin of Fuller Youth Institute. Brad, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Brad, tell us a little bit about yourself and your role at Fuller and your family and all that.
Yeah, well, I help lead the Fuller Youth Institute here. My background is youth ministry, and I continue to serve in youth ministry at my church. And that passion, kind of coupled with a passion for research, led me to the Fuller Youth Institute. And we are a research and resourcing arm of Fuller Seminary. We're just passionate about young people and about the church. And we want to see young people unleashed to change the world. So everything we do is focused that direction. I'm also a dad, have 3 kids. 2 of them are teenagers now, and 1 in elementary school. So my days and nights and weekends are all kind of caught up in thinking about young people and faith.
Yeah, and it's very personal, obviously, at this point, right?
Very personal, yeah. That's right.
So I love the line that you have, like turning research into resources, which is just great, because I guess I'm a research kind of person too. So I think resources are better, when they're backed by research, which is great. And you've had a ton of things. Sticky Faith is probably the thing that people most know Fuller Youth Institute for. But with this new study that we're going to talk about in the new book, Growing Young, in case anyone isn't familiar, what was that study all about?
Yeah, well, Sticky Faith was really born out of this concern, a real concern, that research shows that about 1 out of 2 young people walks away from God and or the church within the first 12 to 18 months after graduation. And as youth workers, as people who care a lot about teenagers and young adults, we just were really disturbed by that, and had a lot of leaders coming to us and saying, what can we what can we learn here? And we wanted to know not just why are they leaving. A lot of people were asking those questions, but what makes a difference with young people who stay connected across the transition? And so Sticky Faith was really exploring those questions. What can we do in our churches and in our families long before graduation that leads to the kind of faith that lasts into young adulthood? Well, as we began working with churches over the years following the release of Sticky Faith, more and more leaders were saying to us, this is really helpful. It's helpful in our youth ministry, but this goes so far beyond our youth and our children's ministry and our young adult ministry. This is about the whole church. This is about intergenerational ministry, which was a big piece coming out of Sticky Faith. But how do we do that? This is something that we've got to have a senior pastor and all our senior leadership on board, but we don't know how to do that. And then at the same time, we were getting these other questions around this gap in the church of 18 to 29-year-olds. And, where are all the young adults? And so we would have pastors saying, what do we do to reach young people today? And what do we do about the young people who seem to be walking away, or, they're not interested in our church. Maybe they are interested in following Christ, but they don't want to do that at our church. And so all those questions kind of led us to this new study, Growing Young, which is looking at churches themselves. And we said, despite all that's going wrong with churches, and certainly demographically, across the U.S., churches are aging and churches are shrinking, and churches have a smaller percentage of that young adult population than ever. Adults 18 to 29 represent 17% of the population, but only 10% of the church. But rather than point fingers, what can we find that churches are doing right? What are they doing well? So we studied bright spot congregations. So we studied over 250 congregations that were nominated because they were doing something well with young people, and in that 15 to 29 range. So we looked at churches doing well with sort of high school, post high school, college age, and then into young adulthood. And that was the focus of the past 4 years for us, just drilling in. We did online surveys, we did phone interviews with over 500 folks from those churches. We did site visits to 12 churches. Overall, we did over 1,300 interviews and logged about 10,000 research hours in the project to just try to understand what are churches doing well, and how can that inspire all of us? What can we do, little things and big things, in order to really engage young people well?
And before we jump into some of the learnings, it probably is worth mentioning a lot of the things that didn't make a difference, I guess you could say, because even like the 250 churches, they were very varied, I guess, right? It was a total mix in terms of size and all the demographics and things like that. So what were some of those examples, before we jump into the results you found, of things that didn't seem to make a difference? They weren't a factor.
Yeah, well, we were really curious about this going in. And so we found in some of the statistical analysis that we did, as well as our qualitative data when we were just looking at themes and examples, we found that church size didn't seem to make a big difference. So, having a really large church isn't a secret, nor is having a really small church. We had churches that were under 100 and over 10,000 in this study. So it was pretty exciting. Church age also didn't make a difference. We had some churches, 5 years, 10 years old, who maybe can be a little more innovative and structure right off the bat. But then we also had some churches over 100, even 150 years old, who were really thriving. And, sometimes because of some long-seated values, sometimes because of some changes they've made in their approach to young people. Location or region of the country factored out, as well as denomination or lack of denomination. So we had a number of different denominations represented, and also non-denominational churches. And at the end of the day, nobody really rose to the top as sort of having the secret, to effective ministry with young people, which I think is good news for all of us.
Yeah, nobody has the market cornered. And if they did, it would probably just lead you to ask, well, what were the attributes or characteristics of that? But that didn't take place. Diversity, was that big? Because I think a lot of people would think that too. Like if you were more diverse, you'd do a better job reaching young people.
Yeah, we were really pleased with the diversity in the study itself. About half of the churches in this study were not predominantly white. And so about a third were multiracial congregations, meaning they had at least 20% or more from at least two different ethnic groups. And then we had a number that were maybe sort of group specific non-white congregations. Diversity was just really fascinating. It's complex, and the more diverse a church is, the more complex it is. But one of the really interesting things we found is that young people tended to talk about the diversity in their church more than adults over 30 did, even in the same churches. So, churches with the same level of diversity, it was just more on the tips of tongues of young people. So it definitely matters a lot to young people in thinking about their church and thinking about diversity.
Yeah, so they're in the same churches, and it could be churches that are doing well, obviously reaching that age group, but they're talking about it more. So it matters more to them versus the folks who are older. That definitely makes sense. One of the things we were talking about before we recorded, something that was interesting to me, and I think listeners will be interested in this as well, in terms of talking about helping students stick and, keep faith after high school and stay involved in churches and all of that. I think some of the things that have been done for a long time, but it's emphasized even more so in the last decade, include like mission trips for students, getting them to serving in general, serving in ministry as a volunteer, right, and having some kind of responsibility in the church. But there was some study about mission trips, at least specifically, that showed that maybe the result, at least the way, in certain ways they're done, wasn't maybe as impactful as we'd like. What was that about? Like, what did you see there?
Yeah, well, there's been some research done about the effectiveness of short-term missions specifically. And, one of those, in particular, some research from Robert Priest and Kurt Verbeek, that found that, despite a lot of growth in short-term missions in the past few decades, not as true in the last decade, but especially in that big growth period, there wasn't a similar growth in the number of people who became career missionaries. That was one finding, which was interesting. But, another layer is that participants didn't necessarily give more money to alleviate poverty or, to participate in those same causes when they came back. And they didn't necessarily reduce materialism. And in fact, in looking at a whole list of sort of possible outcomes, following a mission trip, one study found that within 3 months, any sort of, net effect in someone's practices or that kind of thing following a mission trip seemed to sort of disappear. So, this sort of raised a great conversation in ministry circles around what can we be doing to help that impact actually be the kind of lasting impact that we say it is. We give great lines about this will change your life forever. But for the majority of students, it doesn't seem to be changing their life more than for a couple of weeks. And many of us can look at students, for whom we would point that out. Now, at the same time, the field of service learning has done a lot of research on what helps create more lasting impact from service experiences. So we think we can learn a lot from them in the church. And a lot of that is around, around better preparation beforehand, more framing, more of the kind of why questions around why we're serving, why it matters, more thoughtful engagement with the people with whom we're serving, better processing during, more meaning making so that students have more of an opportunity to kind of understand and make meaning from what they're experiencing, and also sometimes to receive correction for some of the meaning making that's faulty. And then this is the big piece from service learning that we can adapt in the church is the afterwards, this ongoing transformation piece, that to really translate what's experienced and learned during that service time into something that integrates with regular life back home. So it's the connecting the dots time. When we talk with ministry leaders, this is the part that often gets left out. We get back, we get together and maybe share pictures and share stories. But there's not that ongoing, hey, this is how we connect this with life back home, or this is how we can serve in the local community in a way that carries that on. Those kinds of practices are shown to lead to long-term transformation.
And one way that can relate to something in the Growing Young book is one of the things you uncovered is something you called keychain leadership. And there could be a relationship between these two in some ways because you're looking at a way to help students take some ownership, have influence, use that in an ongoing way. So what is keychain leadership and what does that look like, in a church?
Yeah, really good question. Leadership really is a buzzword in churches. And so figuring out sort of what that means. I mean, we looked in, as we began the study, we really didn't want leadership to rise to the top. We really believe in kind of the priesthood of all believers and empowerment. And the more people talked about leadership, we began to see this different kind of picture of what leadership looks like. In fact, over 3/4 of congregation members named leadership as the secret to their effectiveness. But when they were talking about leaders, they weren't talking about just a charismatic leader who, maybe dominates or, a key authority. They were talking about a kind of leadership culture that tends to infuse the whole congregation. And it was one that involves, as you said, giving significant keys of leadership to students. If you think about your keychain and, sort of what's on your keychain, you've got keys that give you access, right? There's access to doors, maybe to cars, you've got, those different kinds of access. Well, on your own leadership keychain, you've got these capabilities and power and access. And keychain leadership is being aware of those keys and handing them off appropriately to others, in particular to young people, empowering them to lead. It's more than just launching a student leadership team, which for the longest time is what I thought was, sort of good leadership in youth ministry. But it's more of a spirit and a commitment that permeates the congregation. We saw a lot of ways that folks would do this in terms of how young people were empowered and given voice. And when you look at the kinds of environments, sometimes people get concerned. Is it, if I just throw keys to young people, what if they drop the ball? What if they don't follow through? There's often a critique, especially of millennials. Well, they're just going to flake out on me. How do we sort of do that? And, the best research out there about formation and development talks about this right balance between challenge and support. And we found that to be true in keychain leadership, that there's this sort of appropriate training and challenging and releasing, right? But also with a fair amount of support. So a few ideas for somebody who's sort of wondering, how to start is even just doing an assessment of young leaders in your church. You could sort of start church-wide, just listing, who are those teenagers or maybe emerging adults who already hold keys, or maybe who are primed who could hold keys to leadership, what that key or that area of responsibility is, and, actually just sort of formulating some next steps of who to follow up with and talk about that and inviting other leaders into that. We found that often this was across multiple generations, that this would be happening with senior leaders, not only targeting, teenagers and young adults, but also targeting people in their 30s and 40s, as opposed to a congregation where maybe a particular age group holds all the power. So a lot of a lot of fascinating things there. One thing I'll add on that is just the importance of, we've talked to a lot of young adult leaders in their 20s who've said, one of the mistakes leaders sometimes make here is that they want to give us keys to doors that already exist. They want us to carry on and sort of perpetuate the programs that they've created and the systems and structures that are already in place. But what we really want and need is to be empowered to envision new doors with new keys. In other words, this can sometimes be disruptive, and we need to be willing for it to be disruptive, and a certain sense of journeying together through into the future, which feels risky.
Oh yeah, definitely. I don't think most people it's one step maybe for some churches to empower young people with keys, so to speak, but then it's a whole other thing to give them that, and then they're going to change what you created. In general, do churches that do a good job reaching young people listen to and involve young people more? I mean, that's what it sounds like. You're probably not giving away keys and giving away leadership, and especially not letting them make big changes without listening to them and getting their input, right?
For sure. And we found that on the whole, young people tended to have more of a seat at the table, and more of just the sense of a voice, of empowerment, of including in decision making, and also that sense of support. I mean, I remember, at one church, the young adults or the teenagers talking about adults in their church said, if you want to help, they help you help. This sense that it's not only that you're sort of allowed to help, but that you are supported in that process as well. So, and again, we found, this really sort of played out in cultural values in the church that tended to sort of bleed into all areas.
I wonder about one of the challenges being, because I think an easy example of this would be like the style of music, right? Like the classic debate among churches or whatever. And your study found that you found it was varied. It's not like there was a style of music or a method or whatever that attracted young people. But that seems like an example where you could have input from younger generations that this is something they want, and then older generations maybe want something different. But if you're going to, reach young people, you probably do have to be willing to give up some things, some preferences, and a lot of that kind of stuff, I would imagine.
Yeah, and we often did find, we made sure, especially in our site visits, that we sat down with senior adults and listened to them and their perspective, because we suspected that there'd be this sense of disenfranchisement, and sometimes the way that change is carried out in churches, senior adults do feel that marginalization. And there's certainly a way to do this, that you can sideline one group or another. One of the real interesting ways that this carried out, and this connects with another one of the priorities we found, was prioritizing young people everywhere across the church. And this was something that in particular with senior adults, we thought, well, isn't putting more priority on young people by default, does that mean that senior adults miss out? And we heard a lot of different things from senior adults about this, but one of the most poignant was this sense that everyone rises when you focus on young people. And when we pay attention to young people and when we invest in them, we all benefit. It brings vitality to the whole church. And one pastor said to us, if you're reaching 20-year-olds well, you're going to reach 60-year-olds. And that, we can feel a little bit cynical about a statement like that. But, we also heard from, grandparents who said, what, we want our church to be the kind of place where our grandkids can worship. And, while we may have friends in our age group who sort of like their worship service a little bit better because it caters to their needs more or their preferences more. We look around and we see our grandkids or people our kids or our grandkids age, and that gives us so much hope for the church. So this sense that, even when we might be most resistant to change, we realize that change is necessary in order to really engage. Now, I'd say on the flip side of that, those changes don't always look like we would think. And young people were surprisingly not that interested in talking about music style and worship style. They didn't bring it up. I think the worship wars have kind of bypassed young people in terms of, they don't see why it would be a way to bring division in the congregation, or a reason to bring division, which is just interesting for us to think about. Not that music doesn't matter to young people, but that it did not seem to be such a huge point of contention, which is just interesting for us who've been around a while and seen how contentious changing music can be in a church.
Yeah, and I guess that could be a variety of things. It could be it's so much more common now to have, like I remember the distinction was like band or not. I mean, essentially you could describe it in more detail, but in a lot of ways that's what it came down to versus now that is so common. You could see where it's not as much of a divide, or if you weren't old enough to live through something like that, you just think,
right,
yeah, that's not really a big issue. I haven't really thought about it any other way. But maybe that was the big divide. In terms of the, prioritizing young people everywhere, use the phrase disproportionate prioritization. And what does that look like practically in some churches? Like, is it about budget? Is it about staffing? Is it about style, preference? What are some ways that churches that reach young people put a disproportionate priority on young people?
Yeah, great question. Well, I mean, for one, it means we're intentionally paying attention. So, we're not just giving sort of the rhetoric of, well, youth are the future of the church, or, we're going to give one Sunday a year to be Youth Sunday. Some churches have actually said, we decided we needed to ditch Youth Sunday because we realized that we were sort of giving them this token opportunity to lead, as opposed to inviting them in to have voice and have leadership throughout the year in what our worship looks like. We weren't really paying attention to, if young people are in our service, does anything in the service speak to them? Are they represented in any way in who's, leading or guiding the service? Are they given any kind of meaningful work to do in the service? So it's more having young people in the conversation. It may have something to do with budget. It's been said that a budget is a manifesto of our priorities. It doesn't necessarily mean how large the budget is, but the allocations, the way that we allocate. If we're allocating way more money to music ministry than to youth ministry, that tells us something about our priorities at church. If we're allocating more money to facility management, just the percentages should tell us something about who we are as a people and who we're paying attention to and how we're listening. But that's just one measure. Another piece was really how parents and families are prioritized. If we're going to prioritize young people, we really have to think about how we are supporting parents, how we're equipping families to live out faith together. All the research would show that parents are still the strongest influence on the faith of their kids through childhood and adolescence. So, we can't just take over for parents. We can't just excuse parents. It turns out that supporting and equipping parents is one way that we can prioritize young people. Another real kind of practical idea on this front is thinking about how do young people play a load-bearing role in the congregation? In other words, do they have meaningful work? Are they just sort of, a token voice that we maybe put up front when we want to showcase, or are we really saying to young people, like, our church wouldn't survive unless you contribute and participate? Do teenagers know, like, hey, our children's ministry, we wouldn't have enough volunteers if you didn't volunteer in our children's ministry. Do teenagers and young adults know, like, the things that happen in this church, our regular ministries, our music, the ways we serve in the community, on and on. We wouldn't be who we are. We couldn't do what we do if you were not part of this. And I think a lot of young people feel the opposite. I think they feel like they're targets, they're consumers, that either we're not paying attention to them at all, or we're hoping to create some kind of slick product that they will consume, and that will be, we're providers of a good and a service that they come and consume, and that's what church is about. And, really, we want to say the opposite. Like, actually, this is about participation. This is about work. This is about being the body of Christ together, which means everybody has a part to play. And without you, we can't be who we are. It's impossible. So I think that's a very different way to communicate to young people. And then we start to involve them differently. We don't always just ask them to babysit when we need babysitters for adult events. We think about ways that they could be involved across the span. We talked to a number of churches who said straight out, anything an adult can do, a teenager can do. And so in our church, we just are intentional about trying to invite young people to do some of the same things, all of the same things that adults do. Now, again, with appropriate guidance or training, often that was partnering them with an adult. Maybe that on a given Sunday morning, there's an adult and a teenager running a soundboard, or students involved in music, but not just a youth band, adults and kids partnering together to teach a class, those kinds of ways. But this real significant sense, not just patronizing young people, but really valuing their contribution right now.
And for some listening, I would imagine the harsh reality is that their church may be more of it's like consumer driven, although it's not the students that are driving it, but they're only teaching them or serving them. Mm-hmm. Like, they're not a part of it in any way, serving, playing roles, things like that. And it does get messy. I mean, I know that from our church. We just had, Easter services, and we have so many students that serve in children's ministry, and one of our preschooler rooms had 2 students serving in it, and we had to wrestle, and not for lack of volunteers. One of the things you have to wrestle with is, like, is that okay? Because then for some people, they want to see an adult. So that's a conversation we've had about that too. And I guess I'd rather live on that end of it, where it's messy and we're pushing the envelope, as opposed to the other end of it where we're not giving them anything, right?
For sure. Yeah. And I know, we talked with one church too, who said, we just began to include in all our planning meetings, making sure we're asking the question, what role will young people play? How will young people be involved? Whether that was planning Easter services, planning summer programming, anything, any kind of planning across the church, across the ministries of the church. The question was, how will young people be involved? And just keeping that question in front of us. I mean, I can think of a time in my own church when this is really a simple example, and it's not even about leadership. It's just about participation. There was a new kind of contemplative prayer group that was starting up, and so it was a ministry being offered. And as they were talking about it in our leadership meeting, I just asked the question of, is this open to teenagers? Could a teenager participate? And it was like, no one had ever thought of that. It hadn't even been considered as a category. And it turns out that, there was no objection at all to that. And a couple of teenagers really ended up deciding to participate and loving it. One of them being one of my daughters, who really resonates with that kind of prayer. And it turns out like that became one of her favorite things, that year as part of the church. And in fact, she's still involved a couple of years later in a group like that. All because of this question of just, well, have we thought about young people? Could they participate, or could they be involved? Could they lead? It's not always just about leadership. Sometimes it's just the spaces where we haven't had a big enough imagination to imagine them into that space.
Yeah, I would imagine that's usually the case. It's not intentional leaving them out. It's just haven't thought about it. And it probably takes intentionally thinking about it over a long period before it just becomes the norm.
Well, it does, because our cultural norm, and our cultural norm has become so much about division. So in this way, the church has adapted, all of our cultural default settings where we've become a society that divides up by age cohort and by, preference and life stage and all these things. And so, you're taught at a very young age, kids go over here, adults go over here. And even kids know that they need to divide up by their age cohort. And so, that's where even this whole model of why would teenagers be off by themselves all the time in church, as opposed to having opportunities to interact and intersect with younger kids, having opportunities to intersect with adults, that rather than that being a natural part of our rhythms, we're very, very divided and siloed. And so, a lot of the work, and this has been part of the work of Sticky Faith as well, has been churches just asking some hard questions about, have we become so divided that we don't know how to be together as a family? Which that word, by the way, that was one of the most common ways that young people describe these churches that are thriving. They said, these people are like my family. It's family here. This is my family. And that sense of warmth really emerged as one of the key factors. And it was one of these 6 core commitments that churches hold in common. And we realized that, a decade ago, there was really this drive for cool, and we need to be the coolest church around. And, we started saying, I think warm is the new cool. That young people aren't as driven by cool. They've got that entertainment value and so many other areas of their life, that what they want from church is some kind of space that feels welcoming, accepting, authentic, family-like. And that warmth kind of covers over a lot of uncoolness in our churches, which again, I think is really good news.
Yes, it is, because it's easier to provide that than to compete necessarily with the entertainment. Right. They're saying you can't even compete with that. And I would imagine the family, if they're going to talk about it like family, it probably means it's not just I feel like family with the other students my age, but it crosses generational lines. So somewhere in there, they've got to be connecting with people older and younger too. For sure. Yes. I've always, this will be my last question. It's a total curveball. So I don't know what you think about this, but I feel like in some sense, churches there are 2 extremes almost when it comes to helping students once they graduate high school. One extreme would be like, we have a college age young adult ministry. And so again, it's like, it's heavily programmed. The other extreme would be like, we don't do anything, become part of the church like a 30-year-old would, or a 40-year-old or whatever, so like we want to keep you here and help you move from the student ministry to this, but there isn't something specific to you. And I see advantages to both. Like I see the advantage that you have an environment in the sense that you're really helping continue to hold their hand, so to speak, make the step easier, I guess you could say. I really see the advantages of the other side too, that we're going to help you become part of the church, so that at 19 or whatever, you are plugged in just as if you were 30. What are your thoughts on that? From research or even just personal experience, do you feel like it's somewhere in the middle? Like we got to try to help them, I don't know, do a little bit of both, or, what's going to serve them best? Yeah, I think this is some of the hard work in front of us as leaders in this really pivotal
time period where even adulthood is being redefined. And I mean, developmentally, we now have this phase of emerging adulthood that extends well into the 20s. And we need more than just a programmatic response to that, but a programmatic response may be part of it. I think there's so much that's contextual. And we have seen churches really begin to lean in and do the hard work of listening. We have worked with this church in Tulsa who they decided to transition a staff member to focus on ministry with young adults. And her pastor told her, your first 6 months, year, however long it takes, your assignment is not to develop a new program. Your assignment is to listen really well and to meet with young adults who are in the church and those who are not, those who've left the church, those who are all around us but aren't coming to church. Just do a lot of listening and gather people together, get together, take people for coffee. Listen to what their needs are, their hopes and their dreams. Listen to even their kind of vision for church. And out of that, to try to understand what are the kind of spaces we need to create in our life together as a church where young people will really feel welcome and embraced, where they'll feel needed, where they'll feel part of a family, but with contribution to make. What does this actually look like? Now, that church is still in the midst of that process. And what they're learning is that, a program answer that involves just segmenting out young adults by themselves may not be the best response. Now, it may be that those young adults need some specific context where they can just be with people their age. But, gone are the days when that in and of itself is an isolated solution. And I think there's a lot that we can learn there. I think young adults are really longing for mentoring relationships. They're longing for meaningful relationships with those in an older generation. And there's, church is one of the unique places where we can provide those kind of contexts still. If you think about it, there
don't get that anywhere else, really.
Many structures. Yeah, there aren't many structures left in our society where cross-generational friendship and mentoring actually exists. And church is a unique context in which we can offer those kind of relationships. Now, to what extent those are programmed and structured versus more informal, I think that's going to vary a lot. And I think that's some of the hard work we need to do in our particular settings.
Yeah, but it's great that they are wanting that, because I don't know that you would have said that about my generation or my dad's generation in terms of the humility and wanting mentors.
Yep.
You know what I mean? So and I think sometimes the perspective is quite the opposite. Like, they don't want that at all. They just want, selfish or lazy. I don't know, all those bad things that are not totally true. But you actually, there's pieces of that in every generation, probably, but I think that
totally. But it was so interesting to listen to young adults too, even to talk about their experience in college of trying to visit a church, or maybe just out of college, trying to visit a church and saying, all I wanted was for somebody to invite me over for dinner. If anyone would have said, do you have plans for lunch? I would have jumped at that opportunity. But as a young person, I was too insecure to do that myself. And, nobody from an older generation was reaching out because they assumed I didn't want that. So just breaking that barrier of they just want food and companionship,
Yeah. And we probably thought about the food part. That's probably not a surprise, but the other part we probably missed. Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah. Absolutely. So even just simple practices of opening our homes, opening our tables, I think that can take us a long way. And some of us too, who are a little older, might just need that reminder, might just need that little prompt of, hey, young people they actually are probably going to be interested in that if you offer. They just don't know how to approach you.
Definitely. Well, I could probably ask a million questions about this, but that's all the time we have for now. And the book is Growing Young, 6 Essential Strategies to Help Young People Discover and Love Your Church. How else can people connect with you and with this project and Fuller, all that stuff? If they have any more questions or want to get resources.
Yep, for sure. They can go to churchesgrowingyoung.com or fulleryouthinstitute.org. And on both, we have a ton of additional resources. And in addition to a free assessment related to growing young, which could be a real, just kind of easy next step, is to take our quick assessment and sort of see where your church is landing right now in terms of these 6 core commitments. We try to help you identify some places to start in terms of next conversations.
That's great. I think everybody should do that for sure. And there's like the free quick assessment. Is there a bigger one that's coming with the premiere? Or is it
will
out?
Be coming. Yep.
Okay,
we will be releasing that this fall. Okay. And so we're working right now. We just wrapped up the academic validation piece on that, and we're working to on the construction piece. So
yeah.
we're so excited about that tool because it'll be a great opportunity for churches just to get their own data, and to see across their whole congregation, to be able to look by age group and different kind of categories to see how people assess what's going on and how we can learn and grow from that.
That's awesome. Well, thank you for coming on the podcast, but also thanks for all the work you and everybody at Fuller does. I mean, it makes a huge difference as somebody who works in the church and has kids. And I don't know, I just feel like many times we would not really know what's right, what's wrong, where we are without folks like you all helping do some of the research and all that stuff. I think we'd be a little bit blind in how we're moving forward and making decisions. And you really help us see what reality is and where we need to go. So I just appreciate that so much. Thanks for all the work you do and for coming on the podcast today.
Yeah, thank you, Nick. It's been great.
The Growing Young study in the book is excellent, and I love all the resources they're putting out with it. I can't wait to see, the big assessment that's going to come out in the fall. And I think that's the first action item. Well, the first action item probably is get the book if you don't have it already. But the second would be to take that assessment, that quick one that they have right now. I think that would be helpful. And then plan to take the bigger one in the fall. Another step to take might be to gather some young leaders in your church and just learn from them. Get to know them more, talk with them, get their input on things. I think the more we listen, the better we can lead, the better we can help young people stick at our churches, and not just stick, but really lead the church now, not in the future, but now. I think that would be really important. You can get all the references we talked about, everything in the show notes at nickblevins.com/episode 50. Be sure to subscribe if you don't already. In the next episode, I talk with Jared Massey, and Jared and I talk about children's ministry in a small church. And if you serve in student ministry, a lot of the principles are the same because it's about leading ministry. It's about small church context and how that's different. That's where Jared leads. He has a heart and a passion for those who lead in small churches. And so we talk about that and what are the differences between maybe leading in a medium or large size church. And we have him define what a small church is. So you don't want to miss that. Be sure to subscribe, and we'll see you in the next episode of the Family Ministry Podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Nick Blevins Family Ministry Podcast. We hope this helps you maximize your church's potential. We would love to hear stories of how you apply what you've learned. You can do that by leaving a comment on iTunes or in the show notes at nickblevins.com.